This video is about how America's military shaped global conflicts. Subscribe for more. In the heart of Washington, D., the flickering glow of the Oval Office signaled a restless night in 1941. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man whose life had been a series of battles against both illness and adversity, sat behind his desk, a grim expression etched across his face. He reviewed intelligence reports detailing the relentless advance of Nazi Germany across Europe. France had fallen, Britain stood alone against a dark tide sweeping across the continent. Across the Atlantic, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler reveled in his recent victories, his ambitions growing unchecked. The FHR believed the world was crumbling before him, and with each new Congress, his vision of a 1,000-year Reich fell closer to reality. His high command, a cadre of generals and strategists, met regularly to plot the next phases of their grand campaign. The room thrummed with tension as maps sprawled across the table, pins marking recent territorial gains, each one a dagger to the heart of democracy. Amidst the chaos, a young officer named Erich Vogel found himself caught in a moral storm. An accomplished strategist, he had been instrumental in planning the rapid blitzkrieg tactics that devastated Poland and France. Yet, as he surveyed the map of Europe, the lines of bloodshed painted on the canvas felt heavier each day. Erich had sworn allegiance to the fatherland, but the ideologies that drove the regime were beginning to gnaw at his conscience. The whispers of dissent began to simmer in his heart, yet he feared the price of betrayal. Back in the States, Roosevelt knew that action was imperative. The attack on Pearl Harbor loomed like a specter, an ominous warning of the global conflict that would soon engulf the nation. He glanced at a photo of his son, Franklin Jr. The thought of his boy, just one among thousands, facing the brutal realities of war was a bitter pill to swallow. The decision was made. Despite the isolationist sentiment thickening the air, America would enter the fray. In a nondescript room in the Pentagon, General George Marshall convened a meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The atmosphere was electric, a charged mix of urgency and fear. Maps of Europe and the Pacific filled the walls, battle plans scrawled in hasty notes. "We need to strike first and strike hard," Marshall declared, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "If we want to have a chance against Germany, we must disrupt their momentum and support our allies." Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, a different kind of conflict was brewing. The Jewish community, bolstered by the horrors of persecution in Europe, was rallying for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. The scent of impending war wafted through the streets as the shadows of the Holocaust grew darker. David Ben-Gurion, a determined leader of the Jewish Agency, understood the stakes. War in Europe would inevitably spread to the Middle East, and with it, the hopes of a nation would rise and fall. Ben-Gurion gathered his closest allies in a hidden enclave. "We must prepare," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil surrounding them. "The world may not understand our struggle yet, but we will not stand idly by as our people suffer. America's involvement could alter the fate of our nation." As the war drums began to beat louder, the paths of these characters would soon intertwine in ways they could not fathom. Erich Vogel, torn between duty and morality, received orders for a new mission that would take him far from his comfortable office. He was to lead a covert operation to sabotage a key supply route in France. With every order, he felt the weight of his allegiance pressing down, threatening to crush the last vestiges of his humanity. On the other side of the ocean, the American military machine was gearing up. Roosevelt's speech to Congress about the attack on Pearl Harbor would galvanize the nation, and once the declaration of war was made, young men flocked to enlist, driven by a mix of patriotism and fear. Franklin Jr. was among them, the call to arms echoing in his ears. "I have to do this," he told his father, who could only nod, a bittersweet pride swelling in his chest. As the Allied forces began to mobilize, Germany was set to execute an operation that would change the course of the war. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This audacious plan aimed to crush communism and seize the vast resources of the East. Erich, assigned to logistics, felt the blood rush to his head as he realized the enormity of what lay ahead. The conflict was no longer a distant strategy, it was a looming reality, ready to engulf him and his nation. Everything seemed to hang in a delicate balance, the threads of fate weaving through the lives of men on both sides of the ocean. In the shadows of war, the specter of betrayal loomed large. Erich's growing dissent would put him on a collision course with the regime he served. In Washington, Roosevelt's desperation to forge alliances and ensure the safety of his nation stewed into a fervent resolve that would soon lead to strategies that would change the world. As the first battles erupted across Europe, the ripples of conflict would soon reach the shores of America. The choices made by ordinary men and women soldiers, leaders, civilians would shape the very fabric of the future. Erich, haunted by visions of carnage, stood on a precipice, ready to jump into the unknown. The conflict was not just one of nations, it was a clash of ideologies, a battle for the soul of humanity itself. Meanwhile, Franklin Jr. urged his comrades onward, the call of duty resonating through their ranks as they prepared for combat. In Jerusalem, Ben-Gurion watched the world unravel, the implications for the Jewish people growing increasingly dire. "This is our moment," he declared to his followers, "but we must act wisely." As the clock ticked forward, the stage was set. America, Germany, Israel, and Europe were on the brink of an unprecedented confrontation. The stakes had never been higher. The war that would envelop them all was just beginning, and the choices made in those fateful days would shape the future of nations. And as the first shots rang out and the world plunged deeper into chaos, the question loomed large: who would emerge victorious from this tempest of history? The fuse had been lit, and the explosion was imminent. The echoes of conflict would soon reverberate across continents, altering the course of humanity forever. What lay ahead would demand sacrifices, tests of loyalty, and reveal the depths of human courage and cowardice. Part 2 awaited, where secrets would be uncovered, alliances would shift, and the true cost of war would begin to reveal itself. The world was on the brink. As 1942 dawned, the winds of war blew heavy with uncertainty. In Berlin, the atmosphere in Hitler's war room was electric as Hitler laid out grand visions for the future of Nazi Germany. His generals assembled around the long oak table, eyes glittering with ambition and fear. "The Soviet Union will fall," he proclaimed, poring over maps that depicted the vast swaths of land soon to be under their control. "Once we crush them, the world will be ours. We will march into Moscow as conquerors." Erich Vogel, standing at attention, felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The confidence radiating from his superiors grated against the gnawing doubts festering in his soul. He could still hear the cries of the innocent, the unrelenting screams that haunted his dreams. The whispers of dissent had evolved into a clarion call. He could no longer ignore the moral decay that surrounded him. Yet loyalty bound him like chains, and with each passing day, the weight grew heavier. "Vogel," shouted General Heinz Guderian, snapping Erich from his troubling reverie. "Your logistics team will be crucial for our operations in the East. Prepare to coordinate the advance. We cannot waste time on trivialities." Erich swallowed hard, the orders tightening around him like a noose. He nodded, masking his internal turmoil behind a fada of military composure. Across the ocean, in Washington, D.C., President Roosevelt was deep into preparations for the United States' entry into the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had galvanized the nation, and young men were flocking to enlist. Franklin Jr., now in uniform, felt the weight of his father's expectations and the burden of sacrifice. As he trained with his fellow soldiers, the camaraderie eased his fears, but the shadow of uncertainty loomed large. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Franklin Jr. and his comrades stood around a campfire. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows across their faces. "What do you think we allow face out there?" an eager private asked, his voice shaky with anticipation. "I don't know, but I've heard stories," Franklin replied, his tone firm despite the tremor in his heart. "Whatever it is, we're going to face it together. That is what counts." In Jerusalem, the situation was growing more dire by the day. David Ben-Gurion, ever the determined leader, felt the pressure mounting. The Holocaust's grim reality was a daily reminder that the stakes were higher than ever. "We need to reach out to the Allies," he urged a gathering of influential Jewish leaders. "If they can see the plight of our people, perhaps we will finally secure support for our homeland." A voice in the crowd, filled with skepticism, replied, "But they are busy with their own battles. Why would they care for us?" Ben-Gurion met the man's gaze, unwavering. "Because we must ensure that they understand. Our fight is not just for territory, it is for our very existence. We are part of this war, whether they recognize it or not." As winter set in, the harsh realities of war began to unfold. On the Eastern Front, German forces encountered the fierce resistance of the Soviet army, the brutal conditions of the Russian winter taking its toll. Yet Erich's logistics unit worked tirelessly, ensuring that supplies reached the front lines. Each shipment felt like a betrayal to him, fueling a machine that devastated countless lives. Yet, he had a plan brewing within him, a plan that could change everything. Back in the States, Roosevelt's push for alliances intensified. Diplomats were dispatched to cultivate relationships with nations struggling against the Axis powers. The Land-Lease Act became a lifeline, allowing the United States to provide critical aid to countries like Britain and the Soviet Union. Roosevelt stood before Congress, his voice firm. "We must stand united against tyranny. This is a battle for freedom, and we cannot falter." Gradually, the tide turned in favor of the Allies. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point. The Soviet army began to push back, bleeding German forces dry. Erich watched the reports seep through the cracks of the regime's propaganda, and for the first time, hope flickered in his heart. Were they truly invincible? Could they be stopped? The whispers of dissent transformed into a roar, and he could no longer ignore it. As battles raged across Europe, Franklin Jr. found himself shipping out to the Pacific Theater, leaving behind the familiar faces of his comrades. "We've got to make every moment count," he told them, hearts heavy with impending separation. "Fight for each other, and remember why we were here." The bonds forged in the flames of training would be tested in the crucible of war, where camaraderie could mean the difference between life and death. In Jerusalem, Ben-Gurion's efforts to rally global support bore fruit as he received messages of solidarity from various Jewish communities abroad. "The world is beginning to listen," he announced one evening, excitement rippling through the room. "We need to establish our presence in the conversation to ensure our dreams for our homeland do not fade into obscurity." As the Allied forces pushed towards North Africa and eventually into Europe, Erich's moral struggle deepened. He had discovered whispers of resistance among his own ranks, men who believed in a different Germany, one that stood for freedom rather than oppression. Fear of reprisal kept most silent, but Erich felt a pull to join them. "I can't stand by any longer," he murmured to a trusted friend, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is a growing movement. It is time to take a stand." His friend looked uneasy. "You know what happens to traitors, Erich. You'll never get away with it." But Erich had long since crossed the threshold of fear. Faces of the innocent he had witnessed suffering haunted him. He had a chance to fight for something greater than the regime he served. It was a risk, but for him it was a necessity. As word of the Allied advances spread, the impact was felt in Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion mobilized his community, urging them to prepare for the changing tides. "The world is watching, and our time is coming. We must not only be passive observers, we must act in our own interests." Back in the Pacific, Franklin Jr. faced fierce combat. Sounds of gunfire and the cries of the wounded echoed in his ears, each moment a test of his resolve. The Japanese forces were relentless, and the stakes were becoming increasingly dire. Survival hinged on their unity and strength, and he pushed himself to lead, inspired by the sacrifices of his father and the many others who had come before him. As the winter of 1943 approached, Erich made his decision. He would join the resistance, a group of military officers and civilians united against tyranny. Their plan was bold: to sabotage key operations and disrupt the Nazi grip on Europe. In secret meetings under the cover of darkness, they plotted their course. The risks were monumental, but the potential for change felt worth the gamble. In Washington, as Roosevelt received updates on the war's progress, he understood that the tides were shifting. The Allies were gaining momentum, but fractures within the Axis powers were emerging. He sensed an opportunity to further solidify alliances, particularly with nations that had suffered under German oppression. "We must keep pushing," he urged his generals. With the ground shifting beneath their feet, the stakes of the war had never been higher. Erich's path collided with Franklin Jr.'s. The lives of these two men fated to intertwine in the chaos. As dawn broke over a world engulfed in flames, their choices would resonate through time, igniting a battle not only for territory but for the very essence of humanity. The stage was set for a showdown, and the question loomed larger than before: would courage and conviction prevail against the horrors of war, or would the darkness swallow them whole? A reckoning approached, and the world held its breath. The world was on a knife's edge as winter set in for 1943. In Berlin, the atmosphere in Hitler's war room was charged with urgency. The Führer, emboldened by past victories, rallied his generals around a massive map of Europe, now a tapestry of blood and ambition. "We will not break," he bellowed, his voice ricocheting off the cold stone walls. "Our resources are vast, and our will is indomitable. The Soviet Union will be crushed beneath our boots, and soon we will turn our attention to the West." Erich Virgil stood at the back of the room, his heart pounding as he absorbed the fervor around him. He had taken the first step towards resistance, participating in clandestine meetings that plotted the demise of Nazi operations. Each time he returned to the war room, it felt like he was stepping further into the abyss. The weight of his loyalty pressed down harder as he wrestled with his conscience. He felt the suffocating grip of the regime tightening around him, yet the flame of hope ignited by the resistance flickered, small but undeniable. "Vogel." General Guderian's voice cut through his reverie again, drawing attention to him. Prepare the logistics for the next phase of our campaign into the east. We need every resource at our disposal. Erich nodded mechanically, masking the turmoil brewing within him. The logistics of war had become a double-edged sword. Each supply run he coordinated felt like a personal betrayal of the very humanity he yearned to protect. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Franklin Jr. was deep in the Pacific theater, grappling with the brutal realities of war. The tropical sun beat down on his company as they waded through the muck of the jungles, enemy fire crackling in the distance. The camaraderie forged in training now carried them through the chaos. Each day was filled with a mix of adrenaline and dread as they pushed further into enemy territory. The roar of artillery echoed around them, a constant reminder of what was at stake. "Stay sharp, boys," Franklin shouted as they maneuvered through thick foliage, the scent of gunpowder and sweat mingling sharply in the air. The horrors of war were omnipresent, yet he clung to the belief that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Tales of sacrifice from his father's generation fueled his resolve. Each man beside him became a brother, a testament to their shared commitment. Back in Jerusalem, David Ben-Gurion sensed a shift in the tide as messages of progress from the Allies trickled in. The news of victories over Axis forces ignited a flicker of hope within the Jewish community. The Holocaust shadow loomed large, yet Ben-Gurion's voice rang out with urgency. "The world is beginning to recognize our plight, but we cannot remain passive. We must prepare to assert our claim for homeland," he implored his followers, his passion igniting the room. While the world battled for survival, a delicate dance of diplomacy began to unfold. Ben-Gurion worked tirelessly to ensure that the plight of the Jewish people would not be forgotten in the chaos. Each meeting with Allied representatives became a chance to echo their urgent need for support. "This is a battle of existence, not just geography," he would argue, his voice imbued with the weight of history. In Berlin, Erich sensed the changes tightening around him. The resistance had begun to gain traction, whispers of rebellion igniting courage among soldiers who had once stood idly by. He felt the pull of destiny. "We have to act before it's too late," he confided in a trusted comrade, Klaus, whose own doubts mirrored his own. "We cannot continue to serve a regime that destroys lives without remorse." As snow blanketed the German countryside, the winter of 1943 transformed into a brutal crucible. The Eastern Front, once an avenue of relentless aggression, had become a quagmire of despair for the German soldiers. The Soviets had turned the tide at Stalingrad, and the ripple effects reverberated through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. Erich's logistical units struggled against the deteriorating supply lines, the stark reality of defeat clawing at the edges of his resolve. "Another shipment lost," Klaus muttered bitterly as they reviewed reports of ambushed convoys. "We could have saved lives if we had acted sooner." The word struck a chord within Erich, echoing the growing urgency of the Resistance's mission. They were not just sabotaging operations, they were trying to save their souls from the clutches of tyranny. As Franklin Jr. faced the relentless advance of Japanese forces in the Pacific, he felt the burden of fear and responsibility pressing down on him. They had secured some victories, yet it seemed every day brought new challenges. The ambushes were relentless, and young men were falling around him. "We've got to keep pushing forward," he urged his squad as they regrouped after a firefight, their faces smeared with dirt and battle weariness. The resolve of the American soldiers strengthened with each victory, but the toll of war was exacting. Franklin began to write letters home, pouring his thoughts onto paper. "We fight for freedom, Dad," he wrote, "and I want to let you down." Each word was a reminder of the legacy he carried, the dreams of a nation resting heavily on his shoulders. In Jerusalem, the Jewish community rallied in support of Ben-Gurion's vision. The news from Europe ignited hope. "The tides are turning, but we must be prepared," Ben-Gurion declared as he met with a coalition of Jewish leaders. "We are part of this war, and our fight for homeland is as much a part of history as the battles being fought in Europe." His words ignited a passion that fueled the community's efforts, and they began organizing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation with fate. As the winter deepened, Erich's resistance grew prepared for their most audacious plan yet. They would target a critical supply route, aiming to disrupt the Nazis' flow of resources to the Eastern Front. "This is it, the moment that could change everything," Klaus said, determination etched into his features. "If we succeed, we could buy time for the Allies and bolster our cause." The night of the operation arrived, shrouded in darkness. Erich's heart raced as he and his comrades crept through the snow-laden forest. Each step felt like a monumental act of defiance against the suffocating regime. They moved like shadows, their breath visible in the cold air, the weight of their mission tangible. In the Pacific, Franklin Jr. faced a new front as his unit prepared for a major offensive on a strategically vital island. The atmosphere was taut with anticipation, the fears and hopes of countless men hanging in the balance. "We need to show them what we're made of," he rallied his comrades, their spirits bolstered by the thought of home. "This is for everyone we care about. We cannot falter now." As Erich and the resistance reached the supply route, time stretched like a taut wire. The stakes had never been higher. In the flickering glow of torches, they set their charges, their hearts pounding in unison. "For the fallen," Erich whispered, summoning every ounce of courage within him. With a breath, he initiated the countdown, the echoes of history swirling in the air around them. The blast thundered through the night, a violent proclamation of defiance against the oppressive regime. The earth shook, and for a fleeting moment, hope surged through Erich's veins. In that instant, he felt the weight of a choice made, a choice to stand for humanity rather than compliance. As the dust settled, uncertainty loomed like a specter. Would the Allies notice the shift? Would Franklin Jr. and his comrades feel the effects of their efforts? Could Ben Gurion's dream of a homeland rise from the ashes of conflict, or would it be extinguished in the chaos of war? The stage was set for a monumental clash, and within the hearts of men, the battles were far from over. The choices made in those desperate moments would echo through time, shaping the destinies of nations. The world held its breath, teetering on the brink of transformation, as the question loomed larger than ever: would courage conquer the darkness, or would the tempest of war consume them all? The reckoning was near, and history was waiting to be written. The dawn of 1944 broke over a world steeped in conflict, the aftermath of Erich Vogel's audacious sabotage rippling across the European theater. As winter faded, the harshness of the past months felt like a distant memory. Yet the weight of the battle still loomed large. In Berlin, the High Command was reeling from unexpected supply shortages, and the once confident atmosphere shifted into one of paranoia. Adolf Hitler, furious and desperate, summoned his generals for an emergency meeting. "Who failed us?" he thundered, his face pale with rage. "We will not allow this act of sabotage to undermine our victory. We must find the culprits and make an example of them." General Guderian, anxiety flickering in his eyes, attempted to reason with the FHR. "My FHR, the resistance is growing bolder. They've taken advantage of our vulnerabilities, and we must crack down hard. But we must also adapt our strategies. We cannot afford to lose the Eastern Front." Erich sat in his shared barracks that morning, wrestling with the aftermath of their operation. They had successfully disrupted supply lines, but the cost of action weighed on him. How many would suffer in retaliation? The camaraderie forged among the resistance was vital, but with each decision came the reality that they were now marked men. "Erich," Klaus said, snapping him from his thoughts. "We need to decide our next move. The Allies are making headway, and we have to coordinate with their advances." The urgency in Klaus's voice was palpable. "We need to harness this momentum," Erich replied, determination hardening his resolve. "If we can align ourselves with the Allies, we could do something monumental. We can aid their assault." Meanwhile, across the ocean, Franklin Jr. found himself on the precipice of a new offensive. The United States had shifted its focus toward the liberation of Europe, and Operation Overlord loomed. The planning sessions were fraught with tension as generals and strategists argued over the best course of action. "We were going to hit the beaches of Normandy hard," Captain Williams asserted, his voice carrying authority. "But we need every soldier at peak readiness. This will decide the course of the war." Franklin Jr. felt the weight of history resting on his shoulders. "We can't afford to fail. The lives of countless innocents depend on us," he spoke, his heart racing with a blend of fear and excitement. Each man around him nodded, reaffirming their commitment to the fight. In Jerusalem, David Ben-Gurion gathered his closest advisors, his eyes scanning the room filled with passionate faces. "We cannot wait for the world to recognize our plight. The time to act is now, and we have to find a way to link our ambitions with the Allies' agenda," he urged. "As they push forward, we must push too toward our homeland." As the spring of 1944 approached, the tide shifted dramatically. The D-Day landings at Normandy were met with fierce resistance, but ultimately heralded a new dawn for the Allies. Franklin Jr., amidst the chaos of the beachhead, fought with relentless determination. "Push forward. We cannot give them an inch," he shouted, rallying his fellow soldiers as they advanced against the German defenses. The roar of gunfire mingled with the cries of comrades, each moment a testament to their resolve. On the other side of the ocean, Erich received news of the landings through covert channels. There was a palpable sense of hope mixed with fear. The resistance knew they had to capitalize on the chaos created by the Allies. "If we can disrupt their lines further," Klaus said, We can make a real difference. Erich nodded, resolute. We were going to take action, but we must be smart about it. We need to coordinate with the Allies. They will need our help as they push deeper into Europe. As the summer unfolded, the Allies began to liberate France, and the Resistance's actions became more coordinated. Erich's group established contact with the Americans, sending messages relaying valuable intelligence. The Germans are scattered. Erich wrote to an American captain, and we can aid in strategic strikes. We can help ensure your advance is unimpeded. With newfound determination, Franklin Jr. and his squad moved through liberated territories, a sense of camaraderie and purpose revitalizing their spirits. "This is it," he exclaimed. "We are reclaiming freedom, and the fight for humanity is within our grasp." While battles raged across Europe, the Jewish community continued to push for recognition. Ben-Gurion's efforts bore fruit as diplomatic channels opened with allies. "The world is beginning to acknowledge our struggle," he proclaimed, energizing those around him. "But we must remain vigilant. We will not fade into history." As the summer wore on, the German forces began their retreat, and with it, the tide of war turned decidedly against them. Erich's group continued to disrupt supply lines with renewed vigor, each successful operation emboldening their cause. With the Allies pressing on, the resistance members began to feel the shift in momentum, and morale soared. "We are part of something bigger now," Erich stated in a meeting with his comrades. "We are helping to bring an end to a regime of terror." The culmination of their actions came in August 1944, with the liberation of Paris. As Franklin Jr. and his fellow soldiers marched into the city, the triumph of humanity against oppression felt palpable. "We did it. We actually did it," he cheered, embracing his comrades in an explosion of joy, tears, and laughter amidst the ruins. Back in Berlin, the reality of defeat settled over the high command like a dark cloud. Hitler's delusions of grandeur crumbled as reports flooded into the Allies' advances. He declared defiantly, but the cracks in his regime were becoming impossible to hide. Erich, witnessing the desperation of the regime, felt a renewed sense of purpose. "We have to be the force that brings it down," he urged Klaus and the resistance. "History will remember those who acted." As autumn unfolded, the Allies pushed closer to Germany, and the resistance intensified their efforts, disrupting communications and operations at every turn. In Washington, Franklin Jr. received orders for a final push into Germany, a direct assault on the heart of the regime. "We'll be in Berlin soon," he said, excitement mingling with a sense of foreboding as he penned another letter home. "The end is in sight, and the sacrifices will not be in vain." As the war raged on, the situation in the Middle East transformed as well. Ben-Gurion's push for a Jewish homeland gained momentum as the horrors of the Holocaust became undeniable. "The world must understand the price of neglect," he urged in a rally, his voice echoing with urgency. "Our moment is at hand. We will not let our people perish without a home." Winter arrived, and with it came the final battles. The Allies stormed into Germany, and Erich felt the culmination of years of turmoil and resistance. "This is it," he declared to his comrades. In April 1945, the Allied forces finally seized Berlin, and the reality of Hitler's downfall became tangible. Franklin Jr. stood amidst the rubble of the city, the sounds of celebration mingling with the cries of the defeated. He shouted, overwhelmed with a mix of relief and sorrow. As the last embers of war flickered, Erich emerged from the shadows, determined to reclaim his humanity amidst the chaos. "We fought for a world where we can live free," he said to his comrades, "but our fight does not end here." In the aftermath, Ben-Gurion's voice rang out, proclaiming the need for a homeland for the Jewish people. "Let this be the moment where we rise, united under a banner of hope," he declared, igniting a fire in the hearts of his people. The world had changed irrevocably, and as the dust settled, the memories of sacrifice and struggle would linger. Erich, Franklin Jr. As they each looked toward the horizon, the dawn of a new era broke, and with it the promise of peace and the lessons of war echoed through time, a reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit.